From the center of the universe, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, this is the SDM Show with your host, Rob Cairns. The SDM Show focuses on business, life, productivity, digital marketing, WordPress, and more. Sit back, relax, grab your favorite drink, and enjoy the show. Here is Rob.
In today's podcast, I sit down with my good friend, Colleen Grazter, and we talk about accessibility and documents. Sit back, relax, learn something, and enjoy the show. This podcast is sponsored by Stunning Digital Marketing, the agency that can help protect your WordPress website today. Go to stunningdigitalmarketing.com and see what we can do to help you protect your business investment. That's stunningdigitalmarketing.com. Hey everybody, Rob Cairns here, and today I'm here with my guest, Colleen Grazter. How are you today, Colleen?
I'm good. How are you?
Not too bad. It's good to have you back. You and I have way too much going on in our life right now, kind of. So we gotta plan a date on a podcast. I think that's the only way to do it, right? So
Well, I need to get you on my podcast because now this is the second time I'm on yours and you haven't been on mine yet. And I need to have you on mine. So
anytime you want, the door is always open. Be glad to. Today you're an accessibility expert, and I thought we would
Well, I like
talk.
to say specialist because there's always something more to learn, right? So
Yeah, that is a valid point. Even experts or people who are well versed in their fields, thought leaders, whatever you want to call them, there's always stuff to learn. My
Mhm.
dad used to say when he was alive, the day you stop learning is the day you might as well die, like honestly. So
Mhm.
I really believe in that. So I hear you. We always talk in accessibility space websites. Well, we're going to talk about websites today because I thought we would talk about documents and how we make documents accessible. And let me preamble this a little bit. I worked for a company in Ontario that was a national organization. So they were mandated by government to do
Mhm.
accessibility because they were a nonprofit. Here we go, in the medical field.
Mhm.
And there's multiple components. There's the web stuff, which we all think about. We should
Mhm.
sometime, not today, talk about emails because that's a whole new can of worms. What do you do with an email list?
Mhm.
I had the pleasure of managing that side of it and I did a contract with them and brought that up to gear. And then there's this whole document side of it. And I know they were deep in the documents and things like that.
Mhm.
And I think most people just kind of ignore them. So, and we all think accessibility as two things: people who are blind or have visual impairment, and people who can't hear. And what I would argue before we even jump into documents is my 79-year-old mother, because she's older and doesn't see the way she used to, she could have an accessibility problem on the web. So where do we start?
Absolutely.
Where do we start with that?
Well, so first off, so websites and accessibility, that gets so much more attention
Yep.
because of the lawsuits that have been going on since about 2017, 2018. So I think that's why you
Mhm.
don't hear much talk about accessible documents. Plus, there's this myth out there that, well, documents just can't be made accessible. PDFs aren't accessible. They're not the right format. The problem is that most of the documents out there, like most websites, are just not accessible. They can be accessible, but they just aren't. So they just have gotten less attention. But because of all this traction that the lawsuits have gotten with websites, it's like now people are like, oh, documents. I need to get my documents made accessible too, because especially if they're part of a website, right? Because if that's part of the website, they need to be accessible as well. But I mean, like my business has exploded over the past few years because of specifically to document accessibility. Like it's crazy. There are fewer people that do document accessibility of any kind. And then there's fewer people that even do InDesign accessibility, which is what I really specialize in InDesign to PDF, like as opposed
Yep.
to Word and PowerPoint, so I think that's why. And like to your point about like when we think of types of disabilities, there's also disabilities that are like related to motor skills. So people may not use a mouse because they might have multiple sclerosis, right? They might have fine motor issues. So they can't use a mouse because they can't necessarily like, make that shape with their hand, hold the mouse, or they might not be able to point to something precisely on the screen, right? So they use the keyboard instead, right? There's also people with cognitive disabilities too. And then there's temporary disabilities. And I had one of my own, for the last several months, after breaking my hand, so those are some things that, so a lot of people don't often think about.
Yeah. And I would say to you, and as we go into this mobile world we're in, and there's no question we're in a mobile world, accessibility is even a bigger problem on
Oh
things like
yeah.
a smartphone on a small screen. Like you carry around a smartphone. I don't know about you, but I carry a smartphone and an iPad in my bag all day, every day, no matter where I'm going. And I don't necessarily carry a laptop with me because my iPad's got a 5G card in it. So I carry
Hmm.
both. And it's not as bad on the iPad, but I'll tell you, on the phone, I can just see somebody who's got a visual impairment having big problems on the phone.
I can't stay on the phone. Like mine is, unless I leave the house, I just use it for emergencies. I want to look at everything on a bigger screen.
Yeah.
I don't like using the phone, and it's too difficult to type on. I don't know.
No.
I got fat fingers. Like I can't, I don't know. I'm not one of those people that can type on it well. I hate it. I actually will do the voice to text though.
Yeah. You'll laugh. On the iPad, I actually use a Bluetooth keyboard for the same reason. The touch
Mhm.
screen
I
just
have
doesn't
a
work for
keyboard. Yep. Yeah. I don't like the
me.
touch screens. Yeah. I use the keyboard on my iPad too.
Yeah.
That's funny.
So I think, it's funny, but we get in this whole accessibility thing. I know with websites, there's some accessibility checkers out there. Are
Hmm.
there such a thing for documents?
Yeah, there are. So there's a ton of them actually. So the first thing to understand though is that you have automated checkers and then you've got manual checks that a person actually has to do. So you're going to catch some low hanging fruit with automated checks. They can assist you in the process of checking documents for accessibility, but they're not the be all end all. And I have a lot of clients and I teach a lot of designers, and it's like one of the first things that they think that is the truth is that if it passes the accessibility checker at Acrobat, then it's good. And that's not the case at all. So with automated checkers, they are going to detect, some stuff, not the majority of issues. The majority of issues are going to have to be manually checked, right? So Acrobat's got the built-in checker. That's something, if whatever software you're using, because you're not creating a PDF in Acrobat, right? You always create it elsewhere. So in the process, you can always go ahead and you can export to a PDF and then run the Acrobat checker, the accessibility checker there. So again, it can't check for everything. It's, and you don't want to rely on it. It's a good start. It's part of the troubleshooting process. It can't check contrast, for instance. It can't tell you if your document title is a good document title, right? It can tell you, like a lot of people will put like a whole bunch of dates and numbers and other things that are meaningless to the screen reader user, right? Or even to the sighted user to see the document title. But the Acrobat checker would pass it if there is a document title, right? Same thing with alt text. You could have insufficient alt text, but the checker might say, well, that the images have alt text, so they're good. You might have images that shouldn't have alt text, but it can't make that decision for you, right? Same thing with like headings, if the correct heading tag was used, or if the content's in the correct order, the correct reading order is what that's called, reading order. So Acrobat Accessibility Checker is a start. A more comprehensive checker is called PAC, and that's Windows only. So all you Mac users, if like I'm a Mac user, I just download Parallels. Well, I had to pay for it, but you can also do like Boot Camp, or you can do, I think there's another one. Oh, just like partition your drive. You can install Windows as a partition on your computer, and then you can run it that way. So PAC is really good. It's more comprehensive. It does PDF UA checks in addition to WCAG checks. Again, there's still manual checks that have to be done. And then so that's free. Then there are some paid ones that are really comprehensive called Access PDF, and then Common Look. And so those are both paid. They'll do way more than the Acrobat checker. They also help you fix things as well. And then something that's actually built inside of the inside of Acrobat, but it's not a checker, but a lot of people think it's a checker. It's called Read Aloud. And so a lot of people will go and open a PDF document and they'll go, oh, well, my alt text didn't read in Read Aloud, or, my headings aren't being read as headings or something. And it's like, well, Read Aloud is literally, it's weird because it's like, it's a screen reader, but it's not like a proper screen reader.
Yeah.
And I'll get into some of those in a minute, but so it doesn't read the actual tags and the document structure, right? So it's not something that you can use to like actually check your PDF. It's not going to help with that. But a lot of people do it, but it's like, you don't really need to bother with that. And then, depending on what software you're using, there might be a built-in checker, an automated checker that will let you check certain things. So like Word and PowerPoint have them, for example. You can run a checker. And then there's also, so that's like for checking the document overall. But then there are contrast, like there's checkers for different things, like contrast, right? There's the TPGI checker. That's a good one. The WebAIM checker, like the WebAIM checker is a website and you can go and input the codes there. But the TPI color contrast analyzer, which has a British spelling, that one you can actually sample right on your screen. So you don't have to input codes. You can actually just sample on the screen. You can do either one. And then Venngage, which I just did a podcast about this, actually, it's like the accessible alternative to Canva. They have a whole slew of checkers in their software. So you could lay out infographics and small documents in there, just like with Canva, but you have a lot more things that it would allow you to check. Then you have color blindness checkers. So like, especially if you're creating infographics and you've got charts with different colors, if that's how you're conveying information, then you need to make sure that someone who might have color blindness would still be able to understand those charts, right? So some of those checkers are Sim Daltonism, which is really cool because that's an app that you can download and then you can just open it in whatever size window you want and then overlay it on whatever software you're using to see how that graph, for example, would look to someone with different forms of color blindness. And then there's also another one that's called Coblis. I think they might have an app, but they have a website where you can upload the image and then it will show you like all the different types of color blindness there applied to that image. And then, like I mentioned, Venngage has that built in. You can see all forms of color blindness in there. And then Adobe Illustrator has a couple of them, but only a couple different views, but it's got something, right? So these are all some different things. And then of course you can use an actual screen reader to also check your document. So for screen readers, the most popular ones are NVDA and JAWS. Those are Windows only. Yep. And then VoiceOver is on the Mac, but the desktop experience with VoiceOver is a nightmare. So I definitely recommend, if you're a Mac user, get Windows software on there and download NVDA. It's so much easier. But VoiceOver on iOS is a lot better than on the desktop. And then other type. Yeah.
Let me stop you for a sec. You're talking about the difference between Windows and Macs. And I know this isn't document specific, but I think it's worth having a conversation. Are you better on a Windows machine if you got major accessibility issues than a Mac, despite and I'm not trying to start a Windows Mac. Remember the old, if it's a PC, if it's a Mac commercials? I'm not trying to start that, but that's a fair question. And then on the phone side, are you better on iOS or an Android? Is there one that's better than the other?
So when it comes to Mac versus PC or Mac versus Windows, yeah, I mean, I get that question. I have used a Mac for the past like 30 years and I haven't changed that because of accessibility work. I just simply installed Parallels and then I can run any kind of Windows software. So I can design an InDesign on the Mac and then Parallels just opens like it's another program and then I can drag and drop things into it, use the screen reader there, use the Pack software there, anything that I need to do on a Windows machine, I can do right there on my Mac. So there's no barrier at all there and there's no difference at all. Yeah. I mean, for the iOS, I don't know that there's a difference with Android versus iOS. I don't have enough experience with actually viewing those on that, but I haven't tested anything on there in a while. But I do know that if you're going to use VoiceOver, you definitely want to use iOS over desktop for sure. But yeah. But the other thing too that I should mention maybe is that, when it comes to PDFs that are accessible, you should be using Acrobat to read them. So whatever you're using Acrobat. So if you could get Acrobat on either platform, it shouldn't matter, how that gets, voiced by assistive technology.
Yeah. The other thing I was listening to, and you and I have had a couple of these conversations, including on another podcast, is you're talking about things like alt text. You were talking about things like headings in your documents. And I was sitting there thinking, this sounds like an SEO discussion, to be honest with you. Right? And you're laughing at me because I think some of the same things that you put into accessibility are good for SEO.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's why I was laughing, because that's totally true. Right. Yeah. When you have those headings and you have things tagged a certain way, that's setting up the structure for the document. And you have to have, in order to do that, you have to start with a tagged document. So you have to have something that's going to export as tagged PDF, which I could go into that if you want me to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Take that.
Yeah. So this is going to also come down to like, okay, well, if I'm going to create an accessible document, like what am I going to start with? Because you're going to need to have software that's actually going to allow for the tagged PDF, right? So you need to have that. What software is going to let me have a tagged PDF? So you've got InDesign, which is going to get you most of the way there, right? It's always going to be work done in the PDF no matter what. So you can have a fully accessible InDesign document, or as accessible as it will get InDesign document. You're still going to have some stuff to do in the PDF. Okay, Word, PowerPoint, like I mentioned earlier too, Venngage, Canva, even Quark Express. And then Affinity Publisher recently came out with accessibility features. I'm in the process of testing them out. But any kind of software that will allow you to export to a tagged PDF, because otherwise you're going to have a really hard journey ahead of you. You'd have to manually do everything, and that would be a nightmare. So like I said, InDesign will get you most of the way there of all those ones that I mentioned. Venngage does a really good job though, but that's really good for short documents. You don't want to like go lay out like an annual report in Canva or Venngage instead of using InDesign. That wouldn't be the proper tool for the job, right? The other thing to consider too is always start with the source file whenever you can, rather than trying to go backwards. Oh, and now I've got the finished PDF. Let me make this accessible. If you can get access to the source files, it's so much easier. And especially if you're going to have to change the colors of something. I mean, if you have to do that in Acrobat, that's a nightmare, right? So anytime you can start with the source files. And then also when it comes to the software that you start with, you want to use the built-in features. You want to use paragraph styles. You want to use the table of contents. You don't want to manually create a table of contents. And also, like, I know designers hate table of contents, but I'll tell you, they will save you time. I know that they could be a pain in the butt to actually set up, but they're all based on paragraph styles. And once you do that and set it up, you don't have to manually go check pages. And then what if your client makes a change and then you have to remember to go back? Oh, did I check this page? Is it still on that page? You just run the checker again, right? But it's actually good for accessibility because it's going to generate the proper tags in the PDF, right? So, and then like with tables, like using the proper table structure, like setting up a table in Word, setting it up in InDesign as a table, not something that looks like a table, but something that actually uses the table functionality. Because what I see a lot is that designers will actually draw a separate text frame for every single cell in the table. And then they will draw the rules, the lines, horizontal and vertical lines, and they will make it from scratch instead of just using the table feature, right? And that's not going to output as a table in the tags. So when you use the built-in features that are available in the software, that's taking care of a lot of that work for you without you even realizing it. And then the other thing is that when you use that software, you always want to style for structure and content. So like you were talking about headings and text with SEO. Well, that's where like the paragraph styles are coming in, right? So you style headings, not just based on how they look, but like, how are they structured? Is this really a heading, or is this just like big, large purple text, for example, right? So that those styles for the headings, that sets up the structure of the document. That helps somebody understand what section am I in and what's a subsection of that, so they can understand the document better. Because the screen reader user can go in and they can just pull up a list of headings in NVDA or JAWS, for example, and then they can go right to those headings. Just like a sighted user can visually scan a page in a document and then go right to that section, So that's the other reason headings are so important, just from a visual standpoint, but also from a tag standpoint. And then the other thing too is like, you really gotta, whenever possible, whenever this is a possibility, build accessibility into the file. So even with the design, so not just like the setup, but also the design, because the last thing you want to do is get a design done, send it to the client, get it approved. And then you're like, well, now I'll check it for accessibility. And now I've got to check, right. And now I've got to change colors, or I've got to darken a color, or, and it's like, now it's a totally different design. Right. I mean, it doesn't have to be, unless you know the tools, the tips and tricks how to mess with that. But, it can end up being a totally different design. And then it's like, well, now you have to get it approved again. And that's just costing more time and money. Right. That's taking up more time in the schedule. So, you always want to build accessibility in mind with the setup and then with the design as well.
I agree with it. Kind of moving forward, you're mentioning headings. Is one of the biggest problems, people don't put enough headings in their documents. I see that constantly. And I don't consider the fact I have an accessibility issue, but you read a long document, they don't break it up enough. And the other is they don't use the right types of headings typically. What do you kind of think around that?
Yeah. So what I see a lot, and I've seen this from people that do accessibility work, because so website accessibility is a much bigger thing than document accessibility, and then InDesign and PDF accessibility is much smaller. And it's like some of the work I see, even from people that do this work, I see things wrong when it comes to headings. So and again, like the Acrobat checker is going to pass this, but like you might have a document that clearly has headings. Like as a sighted user who can see it, I can see there's clearly a title here, then there's a heading and there's a subheading, and I might open up a PDF and it's all paragraph tags. So that's telling somebody that can't see it that these are just paragraphs and there's no headings for them to navigate the document by, right? So like sighted users are going to visually scan the document. AT users, screen reader users, can use the headings to navigate, right? They can go skip to, and they can pull up the menu. But yeah, so I see that a lot, where I see body text that is large and bold. Maybe it's like a pull quote, or just some large text as a call out, and it will get styled as a heading, because a lot of designers will think, oh, well, it's large and bold, so therefore it's a heading. That doesn't make it a heading. What makes it a heading is that it's starting a new section. It's starting a new section of content, right? So and there's no like set number of like headings you ever have to have, but you really should have, like, your H1 should be the title of your document.
Yeah.
Like if you have a book cover, that's going to be your H1. I mean, you might have chapters and other sections that start with H1s because you've only got 6 level of headings, and sometimes you end up needing more than that, and you only get 6 levels. So but with documents, you can actually have more than one H1, so you can have them, like I said, for like the title of the document, and then also for each chapter. Like I worked on documents with like 400 pages, and it's like, I've only got 6 headings. What am I going to do here so I don't run out of headings and make this document make sense? So it is common to see a lot of H1s in a document, as long as they're used correctly. But then you have to understand that what a heading is, starting a new section, or it's a new subsection under another heading. So you have to really, it's setting that hierarchy in the document. So you have to really understand, is this a heading or is this paragraph text, right? And then there's other tags too that you can use to, to denote like captions and block quotes and things like that. But like we don't have, and lists, of course, but with PDF tagging, you don't have nearly as many tags as you do with HTML. There's a lot fewer tags, but yeah, so those are the things I usually see with headings. But yeah, they can help with SEO as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we kind of look at fonts, right? And my biggest pet peeve. And I definitely have a distance problem, like seeing, but I don't have a reading problem. But when people go to the default fonts, and I think in Word, isn't the default font like 12 points? Like, I'm sorry, even for me, a 12-point font is kind of small. So, and then you throw that at somebody who's got a visual impairment or a seeing problem or a senior. Good luck with getting them to read that document. shouldn't we be thinking really highly about using a bigger font, maybe a different font too?
Yeah, and it depends on the font because some typefaces are going to be larger than others or
Yeah,
smaller
of course.
at the same point size, right? So there's that. So there's no like minimum font size to use or anything like that. But yeah, if you have a specific audience, like I had a client for years that they were serving senior citizens, and it's like, okay, well, yeah, 12 point isn't going to cut it. Let's make it larger, right? So the default was always like, we're going to use a larger font for that. So yeah, you have to think about things like that for sure. And then, like the typeface, there have been studies that show that, like for dyslexics, that, okay, Verdana and Arial, Helvetica, like some of those fonts do much better when tested than say like there's some of these special fonts for dyslexia, right? So those actually can impair reading for people who don't have that issue. So sometimes it's like just keeping with simpler is better than, trying to do something super specific. And then it ends up like you're trying to help a group of people, but then you end up like alienating more people because then, so.
So yeah, fonts is always an issue. And then, you were talking a little bit about contrasts and colors. And
Mhm.
I know every time we get into the color contrast discussion, it opens up a can of worms and it keeps giving and giving and giving. Why do people, and again, I don't think I have a color issue, but I look at some of these colors and honestly, I say, oh my God, Colleen, that how can you design that way? Like, do people not think their color schemes through and their contrast schemes through? I wonder.
I mean, I say those things now, but I am very guilty of making the same mistakes in my career. Like
Mhm.
what I see a lot is white text on yellow, white
Yeah.
text on like a really light turquoise blue. And I'm like, gosh, like that is so hard to read. Like for me now, that's super hard to read. And I don't have a visual disability, but I do notice that like I'm becoming farsighted. So I'm like, I have the issues with that. And like reading things on supplement bottles, a little fine print and things like that. And then with contrast. And I see it on package design too. So I see it on package design, I see it on documents all the time. But yeah, I'm
You mean
guilty of
like
making
that?
those same mistakes.
Yeah, yeah,
But yeah,
yeah.
so you definitely have to think about that because even if you can read it okay, don't assume that everybody else can read it okay. Yeah. But the other thing too that about contrast, which is this is going to really disrupt the industry, is that WCAG is, we have the color contrast checkers that use WCAG calculations to do the contrast checking. Well,
Yeah.
several months ago, I had Andrew Summers on my podcast. He's a movie producer and he's dealt with color and light and visual issues for decades. And he's part of the committee that works on, WCAG. And he is like, look, the WCAG calculations for contrast are wrong. There's a lot of colors that the WCAG checkers will pass that they shouldn't. And then some that it fails that it shouldn't. So that's going to be part of like WCAG 3, but that's not for years to come. But if you really want to make sure that your colors are maximally accessible, it's really good to check contrast with not just a WCAG based checker like the ones I mentioned earlier, but also something like Polypane. They have a contrast checker, which will actually check for WCAG and for APCA. That's what it's called, APCA. It will check both at the same time. So, well, not the same time, but you can do it in one checker. So you could check the WCAG contrast and you could check
Yeah.
that one. If it passes both of those, really good, right? So that's even more accessible. Because it's like you run into these things too, where it's like you'll see black text on not the dark blue it's behind me, but maybe like a little bit lighter, and that will pass WCAG. And it's like that's really hard to read, but the white on it won't pass. And then like white with orange wouldn't pass WCAG, it would pass APCA, but the white on orange, most people would say that's easier to read than black on orange.
I would agree.
So it's really interesting. So there's going to be a lot of disruption in that in the next few years, I imagine. So
No, I would think so. Industries with documents. We know anything government, you have to be
Mm-hmm.
accessible. That's in the States. I think it's the law in most states now, right? Canada, it's the law in most provinces. Any
Mm,
nonprofits kind of fall into that category. And then other industries where we seem to see a lot with documents is things like restaurants,
mm-hmm.
the restaurant industry is always somewhere in the middle of the lawsuit mess. Um, because people go in and they want to eat, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
reality. Is there any other big industries where it's kind of falling into place?
Well, so we have a federal law here, Section 508, and we have
Yep.
ADA.
Yep.
The lawsuits happen under the ADA all the time. But so federal laws, those affect not only the government employees, but also anybody that does work for them.
For them, yes.
So anything that you produce for the government needs to be accessible as well. And yeah, so I mean, anybody, like, think of like anybody that is serving, like they're a place of public accommodation, right? They're serving the public. They might act, so if they get funding from the federal government too, like I have a lot of clients that are nonprofits, but they might not have to abide by an accessibility law, but if they get funding for a grant
And they have
for
to.
some projects, then they have to, then all that work has to be accessible then. So yeah, you run into things like that. But what, like the places you're talking about, yeah, those are good examples, like banks, anything like medical, healthcare. Even if there's not a law though that applies to them specifically, it's like it's so good for business, and it's helping reach 20% or more of that business's audience.
Mhm. I would agree with you. And, you think about banks that I wasn't even thinking about banks, but that's a good one.
Mhm.
Certainly restaurants. I don't remember the last time I didn't read an accessible lawsuit and there wasn't some restaurant involved somewhere, and I think I almost wonder how many of these lawsuits are, and we were kind of talking about this before, how many are actually real lawsuits and how many are just
Mm.
lawyers trolling for business. I gotta
Right,
wonder.
because there are both of those situations. There are users that have a disability, they go to a site, they
Yep.
can't get around, and then they sue. But there are lawyers, the ambulance chasers, that will go to a website and run the wave
Yep.
checker, and then it's like, well, we found some errors. Let me go find a plaintiff now. Yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, that does happen.
Yep. If you were starting out with a new document today
Hmm.
in InDesign, because that's your expertise, um, what would you do? Would you worry about more the layout first before the content, or vice versa, or put the content in and then make it accessible? How would you kind of build that document up?
Well, I start by setting my default styles.
Okay.
So what, like, you could, if you have no documents open, you can set what they call your default styles. So you can have your paragraph styles that are, every time you open a new document from then on, they're going to always appear in your paragraph styles palette. And I love this because I don't have to go create those styles. I'm going to change how they look. I'm going to change color them, all of that. I'm going to change, right? But I've already got everything set up and it's ready to go. So I can just start applying that to
Yeah.
the content and then like flowing it in the proper order. And so, I mean, there's a lot that I would do with the prep. It's like, have those default styles set up, and I always use master pages. I like to have really clean documents and an efficient workflow, and accessibility definitely helps with that. I mean, at first it might seem like, oh, I have to create paragraph styles and I have to do this and that, but it makes everything more efficient. And even if you're not creating an accessible document, you can still use all of this as part of your regular workflow to make things go faster. So yeah,
Yeah.
so I love to use default paragraph styles, and I add to them as I need to in the document that I'm laying out. Just depends on the content. I mean, I usually end up doing documents that are several hundred pages long. And so I end up with hundreds of styles,
Yeah.
but I start only with like maybe, 20 or something, but yeah.
No, I agree. The best way is to start with that and kind of build off of that.
Hmm.
What is the biggest mistake that people make when they're making their documents accessible, in your opinion?
Well, with InDesign specifically, a lot of designers will set the tags with the structure pane in InDesign, and
Yeah.
those are actually XML tags. Those are not tags for accessibility. And I've had several files from designers that are like, oh, I've done all the accessibility, but I would love for you to check the file. And I open it up and I'm like, this all has to come out. Like none of the tagging was done for accessibility. This is different kind of tagging. So that's something I see quite a bit. And I mean, in general, though, with all software, I think not using styles is like that's a huge problem. Yeah.
It's almost why style guides are more and more important, even in the accessibility world, than ever before, right? Is if you have your styles down, and it's easier.
Oh yeah, because you could you could even make that like as a service to provide to your clients, like an accessible style guide or an accessible to start template, like in Word or InDesign or whatnot. And you could set up those defaults in there for like font, like set up the the default fonts you want in there, the paragraph styles, how you want the document to look, margins, get all that set up. So every time they create something, at least that's always the foundation. You can get some of that done up front. So yeah.
In your business, do you do a lot of accessibility audits, Colleen, where a company or client will bring you in and say, could you look at 30 documents or 40 documents and give me a recommendation? Is that pretty common for you?
I have had that. So with it's more common with websites, but I have done audits with documents where, they bring me a bunch of documents and they're like, go through them and tell us what's wrong with them and assign a priority, just like I would with a website audit, but I'm doing it with documents. And so, I have done that.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's a lot of work, like to go through a 200 and a 300-page document is not an easy, do, is it? So to speak.
I don't think, I that would definitely not be easy, but I don't think I've had to audit a document that big. They've been smaller documents for the most part. Yeah.
And if you had 3 quick takeaways to somebody worried about accessibility in documents, where would you start?
Well, okay, so say it again.
Sorry, I put you on the spot. I know. If you had 3 quick takeaways for somebody
takeaways.
Yeah, for somebody starting and they want to make sure their documents are accessible, where would you start?
Okay, so definitely with using paragraph styles.
Yeah.
Definitely start with software that's the proper tool for the job, something that allows for tags. You certainly don't want to go lay something out in some software and then you've put in all this work and then it's like, well, wait, I can't export to a tagged PDF. You don't want to deal with that. Then the other thing, so styles, understand headings and how they're used, because that's a big thing too. Understanding headings, how they're used. Like I said earlier, you don't want to style text as a heading just because it's large on the page, right? You really want to understand how headings are used. And then color contrast for sure, because that affects, that's affecting sighted users, but there are like 2.2 billion people in the US, I think, or no, worldwide, that have low vision. So that is a lot of ground you can cover simply by using colors that have proper contrast together. Those are some big ones there. Yeah.
There's some big ones. Hey, Colleen, I always appreciate talking accessibility with you. If somebody wants to talk to you about documents, web, anything else, how's the best way?
They can reach out to me. If they want training, they can reach out to me at creative-boost.com. And if they're looking for the work to be done for them, then they can reach me at gratzergraphics.com. That's G as in George, R-A, T as in Tom, Z as in Zebra, E-R, graphics.com. Yeah. And I'm on social media as well.
Of course, Sharon. Thanks, Colleen. Have an amazing day. I always appreciate your time.
All right, thanks.
This show is brought to you by StunningDigitalMarketing.com, your Toronto leader in digital marketing services. Not only do we protect your WordPress website, we can help you with your site, provide social media management for your business, or even do one-on-one consulting. To find out more, go to StunningDigitalMarketing.com. Well, thank you to Colleen for joining me on this edition of the SDM Show. This podcast is dedicated to my late father, Bruce Cairns. Dad, I miss you very much. I love you, and I think about you every day. For more information about stunning digital marketing, your digital marketing experts, go to stunningdigitalmarketing.com or go to stunningdigitalmarketing.info to find out all the great places that Rob Cairns can be found on the web.